Hey everyone, welcome to the show. I have David Edward here. He is the author of Atlantis Solved, Final Definitive Proof. So I'm real excited to talk to him today. One of my favorite topics is to talk about ancient civilizations. And so I would like to welcome you to the show, David.
Thanks, Tina. That's great talking to you. And as we were just talking right before you hit record, I think this show's going to like blow people's minds because I'm going to tell you where it was, and you're going to tell us what they were doing.
Yes. So he was explaining that he comes from a more scientific view. Great, but I come from more a spiritual view of Atlantis and Lemuria. I've done a lot of reading about it. I've done a lot of research into it. I've done a lot of feeling into the truth. So, tell us more about yourself and how you even came to write the book.
Sure. So I'm an old guy. If you can't, if you have the video version of this, then
You're
you
not
have
that old. Come
proof.
on.
Well, my beard thinks different. But so I grew up. I was born in the late '60s, just to give you a sense of it. So I grew up in the '70s. I became conscious in the mid to late '70s. I have no idea what I was doing at 3 years old, but and then into the '80s, then high school and all that. So I was a nerd. So I read all the books. Like I read Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, Chariots of the Gods. And I watched all the TV shows. I kind of, and when you get exposed to that stuff, especially as a kid, it just drifts you into Atlantis. That's where you end up because everything else is interesting, but it just feels different. It feels more compelling. There seems to be more information about all that kind of stuff. But then, as I got older, you'd only spend so much time rewatching '70s documentaries on Atlantis, so I drifted off to other topics. One of the things I drifted towards was the source material for Atlantis. This is still as a kid or, in high school, you got to read something. So I've mentioned I was a nerd now several times. I'll just keep going back to that as my excuse. But I would read Plato and some of the other Greek literature, not as an assignment in class, just because I was interested in it, and that's where the Atlantis takes you. So I read all that, and I became pretty well read in Herodotus and Xenophon and Plato and documents in what we would call the classical Greece period. And then that went away too. Right? I cycled through that, and then I got out of high school, went to kind of college, which was great. I lasted in college not even a semester, dropped out, and then I'm like, well, this is no good because I think I'm a smart guy, but I don't have any discipline. So I joined the army, which
Oh
was the
boy.
most it was the most terrifying thing I could think to do, and I believed, and I turned out to be right, but I believed that they would offer the piece of my childhood that I didn't embrace, which is organizing yourself to be an adult, right? I mean, at this point, I'm a 19-year-old kid still. And I was right. I was absolutely right. So I joined the infantry, 11 Bravo, 11 Bang Bang, they call it, because they were offering bonuses. They gave you $5,000 if you joined the infantry. But then I took what they call the ASVAB, all the tests and stuff, and I scored very well. So they recruited isn't the right word, but they used me to fill other needs. So I wound up being a special agent. It was the greatest job I could have ever stumbled into. 97 Bravo counterintelligence agent. So I got trained in battlefield counterintelligence and what they call human intelligence collection, how to interview people, look at people, watch, all that kind of stuff. So I developed those skills. I was lucky enough, I got to invade Panama. I spent 6 months in Honduras, in the Soto Cano Air Base, intercepting DC-9s out of Colombia where they're flying cocaine up and trying to get into Texas. Then my state assignment wound up being with the 513th out of Fort Monmouth, who 2 weeks before I was supposed to get there, were deployed over into what was Desert Storm at the time, and then became Desert Shield and became Desert Storm, all of that. So I had a pretty unique 4 years. When they handed me the re-enlistment papers, I was like, nope, I got what I need. So I got out, and college looked pretty good. So I finished school. I have a doctorate in engineering, 3 master's degrees. I've written 45 books since then. I was president of a university. I actually own 2 successful geospace companies now, tiny, little, but still successful. So I wound up in a good place, and it was an interesting journey. Atlantis resurfaced for me about a year ago or so, because as I mentioned, the older you get, at least as a guy, sleep becomes something that you chase more than you get more of. So old guys can't sleep, pretty much is what I'm saying. So I was awake one night watching YouTube, and YouTube handed me a video by this guy Jimmy Corsetti from this channel Bright Insight, and he was saying he thought he had found Atlantis. And I watched it, and when he was done after 45 minutes, I was like, yeah, he found it. But he got, because I was so familiar with the material, he got a few things wrong. The case could be stronger, but I believed it. So I'm like, I want to jump into this space. I want to independently verify it, which is what I've done. And I want to bring my background and actual science, and principle engineering principles to seeing if we can figure out where Atlantis is. And it turns out it's an easy problem to solve. And that's what we solve in the book. And I can tell you where it is before we're done.
Wow. So you went from a college dropout to president of a university.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. Which university was it?
Aspen University out of
Okay.
Colorado. Yeah, it's a good school.
Wow. And how many books have you written?
45.
Wow. So it's
What are
good
you
to
gonna
be
do?
an old guy. 'Cause
You can't sleep. So what do you know what I keep getting awards. I use Grammarly when I write. It keeps sending me awards. Like, you're in the top 1% of people that type on computers. I'm like, I don't really think I want an award for that. But yeah, you gotta produce, right? So you produce output. I decided to start producing books. And you get what you focus on. And I've focused on writing books. So now I have lots of books I've written.
Wow, I'm writing one right now, my first.
Okay.
So
My first book took me 2 years
yeah.
to give you a feel of it, and now I can write a very, very good book in less than 2 months. So you just got to learn how to do it. And the first one is beyond the hardest, because you don't even know all the mistakes you made until years later, and some of the feedback. Some people are
Yeah.
better at pointing out your mistakes than others, but you know they call themselves critics. I don't know what that is.
Some people live for that. But anyway. And speaking of critics, like I sent a message to someone yesterday on Facebook and I said, I notice you like to correct me on social media, and I'm asking you to stop.
Oh wow, good for you. Wow, what happened?
I haven't heard back from her. I'm not sure if she saw the message, but it's someone I've known since high school.
Okay,
But it's a
okay.
boundary of mine. It's like, what are you just here to correct me and tell me I'm wrong or not accurate? Like, that's not the point of the post.
Well, the internet is a fascinating topic. I get this with a lot of the views from my books, and I post a lot on Reddit about like the Atlantis stuff. And it's exactly what you say, which is someone will come in and they're not really correcting you. They create this slightly more specific, slightly slanted counter argument that they're pretending what you said is. They try and box it, and then they defeat that. And it's like, okay, now I have two things I have to unwind. I have to unwind the nonsense you just said about what I said, and now I have to unwind your criticism of this thing I didn't say. So, but people have
Right.
perfected it, right? They become experts. They have PhDs in complex and meaningless criticisms.
Well, that's fine, but I feel like the energy of it is it's like if you're correcting me, it's because you have an issue with yourself.
Yeah,
So, I don't want to be the recipient of your issues, is basically what I'm saying. So it's just a boundary of mine. I don't like it because I could do it to other people and I don't.
right. Yeah, which is hard in today's world, right? For some reason, we think that all deficiencies have to be immediately corrected publicly. It's like, well, there's a lot of mistakes out there, for us
And
to
some
take
of
all that
these are
on.
just opinion.
Yeah, yeah.
So are you going to drop the bomb on us and tell us what Atlanta is or
I
Atlantis is?
I can tell you where Atlanta is and Atlantis if you want both. So I can nail that 100%. Yeah.
There's no
So
coincidence that Atlanta is called Atlanta.
you know what? I have actually been curious about that, and I have searched and searched, and I can find no association between the two. If you have, I'd be interested to hear it. So
Well, I don't believe in coincidences.
I agree with that.
So I
Absolutely.
believe the universe is very synchronistic. So yeah, I think because Atlantis is located in the Atlantic, Ocean?
That's that is well, and actually, and it gets its name. It actually, the Atlantic Ocean gets its name from Atlantis. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hmm.
from the root of it. It's just like the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, which is close to where this Rishat structure is, which is where I believe the city of Atlantis was. They're called the Atlas Mountains. Well, it turns out that the king of Atlantis, his name was Atlas. So
Hmm.
can it really be a coincidence? You have the Atlantic Ocean, you have the Atlas Mountains, and then we have the King Atlas. I mean, it starts to make sense. And there's tons and tons and tons of those connections. So many, and I can run through them in the course of our conversation, but so many geographically that it's near impossible that this place, this Rishat structure, which is in a country called Mauritania in the Western Sahara desert, it clearly was what Plato was talking about.
Okay. So where did you find your sources, and what
So,
sources did you use?
so let's talk about sources for a second. I vomited out my credentials and background, so I understand, and I've been in the world of, in air quotes, academic research. So I understand that process. I also understand that there's this thing called noise and pollution, and you get to a topic like Atlantis. So typically, yeah, in the academic world, we would do what you just said, which is you want to jump into a topic, you do a literature review, they call it, and you see, well, what's been said, what's the current state of the topic. I started all that with Atlantis and quickly abandoned it because there's almost too much information about it, but we only have arguably one primary source. So that's language we have to use. We have what we call primary sources and secondary sources. So almost everything you can read about Atlantis is a secondary source. The only primary source, or at least the starting primary source we have, is this guy named Plato, which we're familiar. If you talk about Atlantis, you probably said the word or heard the word for Plato. But he was a Greek philosopher who lived in the 4th century, kind of classical Greece, and he wrote what they call dialogues, mostly about this guy named Socrates, which was his teacher. And we view it as philosophy today. Matter of fact, I always point out in 10th grade, usually it's 10th grade, almost every single one of us was handed a copy of The Republic by Plato, a very thick book. And then we walked around for a month and carried it around and didn't read it. So we've all at least been that close to this guy. In one of his dialogues is where he talks about Atlantis, this dialogue called Critias. He mentions it in another dialogue called Timaeus, and he gives us a little information you can use to find the date and stuff. But this Critias dialogue is kind of where the story of Atlantis comes from.
Okay, I'm familiar with Plato and Socrates and probably most people.
Sure.
So why did you hone in on the Atlas Mountains?
Oh, so as I mentioned, I got lucky because I watched this video by Jimmy Corsetti from Bright Insight, and he was already saying this Rishat structure, which is in Mauritania. So what it's called, Rishat. It's also called the Eye of the Sahara, but that's like a informal name for it. But he believed this was Atlantis, and he had lined up some information. Now, and the advantage that he had, and now the advantage I have in kind of moving it forward, is when you look at the Rishat structure, it's Richat, anyone can Google it, it looks like Atlantis. It looks like this thing that's been described. You can clearly see there's a center island, and then there are concentric rings of land and water that would have looked, if you were trying to describe it the way Plato describes it in Critias, is about the best you could do. So it looks just like it. And then you start going through the things that are measurable in Plato. And there are some. He tells us, this thing was this long, that they had to dig a hole this deep, all that kind of stuff. And you start to line all that up, which we can do. And this thing hits it. It hits every single one. Um, there's an interesting line in Plato where he talks about how far inland the city of Atlantis was. And this is a line that is typically ignored by almost anyone who's looking for the physical location. I'll read it to you real quick. This is from Critias. He says, the country immediately about and surrounding the city was a level plain, itself surrounded by mountains, which descended towards the sea. It was smooth and even and of an oblong shape, extending in the one direction, 3,000 stadia. Okay, so that's what Plato says about the location of Atlantis. So a couple things to unpack there. First is what's a stadia, right? We'd have to unpack that, and then we got to figure out what 3,000 of them is. So it turns out this is written during I mentioned the classical Greek period. During that period, they used a unit of measure called the Alexandrian measure of a stadia. Turns out it's 607 feet. Okay, so well, we can use that. And you can take that 3,000 number and you multiply 3,000 times 6,007 feet and you divide it by 5280 or whatever. It's either 5280 or 5820, I forget. Whatever a mile is, I think it's 5280. And what you come up with is 345 miles. And then you look at where the Rishat structure is and you measure how far it is from the sea, and it's 345 miles. So we're not off by any magnitude at all. And when you look at the satellite images, you can clearly see there was a river. In fact, and we found other evidence of a river that would have flowed from the Rishat structure from inland Africa to the sea, which is how rivers work. That's the way you want them to flow. So it fits, and it fits everything else, but also fits stuff like this. So people they'll tell me, now I haven't measured how far inland Atlanta is. In all fairness, Tina,
That
so
would be interesting to look
it,
up, huh?
it would be interesting to look up. Yes, I don't believe that there's a river in the surrounding geography. However, I have not done that research, so you've called me out, and I can do that. I can do it when we're done. So that's good. But as far as the challenge that Atlanta is going to have as being the city of Atlantis is that it's too far away. The other thing, Plato tells us lots of stuff. One of the things he says is that the Atlanteans had conquered uh, Africa, Libya, as far as Egypt, and uh, parts of Europe around the Mediterranean, inland, close to Greece. So in order to conquer those things, and this we're talking, he also gives a date. We're talking this is 9600 BCE, so it's the end of the last ice age. You have to have some geographic proximity to them. So Atlanta is not going to have a geographic proximity to Egypt, but Africa and Mauritania does. So there's lots of things we have to check off to be the city proper. But the other thing I point out is Plato actually tells us there's kind of three contexts to Atlantis. There's the city that we've been talking about. Then there's the continent of Atlantis that we can talk about, and then there's the kingdom of Atlantis. So what I think is things like the Bimini Road and the Azore Islands and Ireland and all these places, Antarctica, that people have found that they want to be the city of Atlantis. Well, it's not the city. We know where the city is now, but it's obviously part of the kingdom. I mean, we're talking about a maritime empire, right? That was active, and all these places they line up to the technology we find. They line up, the dates line up, the people seem to line up, the idea that they were exchanging, trading goods and services lines up. So that all makes sense, but just in the context of the kingdom of Atlantis, not the specific city, because the specific city has a lot more criteria that we can measure, and the only place that meets it on the planet of the Earth is this Rishat structure.
So this eye of Sahara does it look like an actual eye?
Yeah, very much
Okay,
so.
I think I've seen pictures of it. But if it's 345 miles from the coast,
Mhm.
so what's the timeline for Atlantis? Have you discovered about how long ago the
Well,
city
Plato
was
tells us,
thriving? Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Plato tells us specifically. He gives us the chain of custody for the information, and things that we know about the world today all line up with that date. So the nice thing about the Eye of the Sahara, the Rishat structure being the city of Atlantis, is it doesn't contradict anything. We tend to like in these fields to do air quotes around mainstream academia and people that won't change their mind. But for this to be Atlantis, they don't have to. No one has to change their mind. So what was a specific question you asked me? I drifted off in my wanderings.
The timeline of when
Timeline. Okay, timeline.
Atlantis, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we're talking. So he tells us that this guy Solon, who was Critias's great grandfather, and this is Plato recording this, went to Egypt in 600 BCE and talked about all kinds of things. He was one of the first Greek politicians. Matter of fact, arguably, he's the guy that thought democracy might be a cool thing to try. So he's kind of the first person we can find historically that invented, if that's the word you want to use, or came with the idea of democracy. So while he was figuring that out, he went to Egypt. I mean, there they are. They've been around for thousands of years. They're a place to go to ask about how to govern. And they go through all kinds of things. One of the things they go through is ancient Egyptian history, which and most of this is recorded on the walls of things in Egypt. We've all seen that, the hieroglyphics, and they basically convey the story of Atlantis to him. They spent a lot of time with him on it, and he wrote it down. I mean, he went to great pains to write it down. They helped him translate it into Greek and everything. and he wrote it down in a scroll. And then that scroll made its way back to Greece. And this guy Critias goes out of his way through Plato to say that he still has possession of the scroll and he's read it. So we're getting, this is not it, some people will criticize the story of Atlantis and say it was an oral tradition. You know, how could it be right? But it's not it's a direct copy of what was on the walls of Egypt. We actually have, and we have a person after Plato who goes and verifies this, so we can talk about that. But in there he tells us this happened in 600 BCE, and this whole story takes place 9,000 years before they're telling this guy's song. So that gives us 9600 BCE, which is an incredibly astounding and important date. The next thing anyone who digs into this will discover is there's this thing called the Younger Dryas, which we all talk about. Well, what is the Younger Dryas? Well, what's a Dryas would be a first question. And what a Dryas turns out to be, it's just a plant. It's a flowering plant that does really well at higher elevations and colder temperatures. So when they go dig stuff up and they look at the different layers to find out how old things are, they can see how many of these dryases were growing. And from that, they can assume to a great degree of accuracy what the temperature was doing at that time. And you tend to get more dryases when the earth is colder. Which is why they call them, events. So we had the Younger Dryas for thousands of years where these things bloomed. Then we had the Older Dryas and the Oldest Dryas. So those are the three Dryases. I don't know who's naming this stuff, but anyway, the most recent
Someone
one.
obsessed with the driest plant,
Yeah,
apparently.
exactly. Someone who likes flowers. But anyway, so the Younger Dryas, and the end of the Younger Dryas is an incredible event on the planet. And again, this is accepted science, which is something happened. And the temperature of the planet increased 30, 40 or more degrees Fahrenheit in a very, 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 very short period of time. It can be argued it was anywhere in the course of a couple days to no more than a year. In either case, in any of those, in any span in between there, that's a massive amount of time. Now the cynic then says, well, what the ice caps were melting and the slowly rising water, they didn't see it for 4 months, that kind of stuff. But it's like that's not exactly how this works, because ice is heavy, and as it melts and it goes into the ocean, water is heavy too. And all the weight is shifting around as it's melting. So then you have what they call, the tectonic plates and all the different plates we're familiar with. When you look at what one of the geological structures called the Atlantic Ridge, it runs right down the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's very thin, so it's very susceptible to shifting. And if all of this had happened and there was a massive shift, I think the most logical explanation is there was a big tsunami. Now, other people they like asteroid impacts. They like string of pearl from a comet that impacted all kinds of planets, and they like all kinds of things. But I don't know. I don't need to argue what it is, because when you look at the satellite imagery from the east side, so from the center of Africa looking towards the Atlantic Ocean, you can see the remains of the water rolling off. So you can see that a massive amount of water came over into Africa, and you can see that it rolled away. There's also other evidence. We find unfossilized whale bones all over the Sahara and the Western Sahara Desert. Well, if you're a whale just kind of hanging out, and all of a sudden you discover you're in a 1,000-foot tsunami riding it into the middle of the African plain, that's where you're going to end up. And there's no other way. No one's going to drag a whalebone 400 miles. You know what I mean? So and they're unfossilized, so we know the timing is right. Also, Mauritania, but all of Central and Western Africa, one of their major imports is salt. Well, all salt is sodium chloride, and all comes from the sea. And this is salt that's very close to the surface. It's not millions of years old when this part of Africa was a seabed, a billion years ago or something. It's more recent than that. So all of those things point to a big water event, which is, again, what Plato tells us. Plato tells us that the city of Atlantis sunk under the waves in the day and the night. Well, that's what it didn't say it sunk into the ocean, and that's another piece of confusion. He said it sunk under the waves. Well, a tsunami is a wave. I mean, that would be exactly what we would expect from a tsunami. Now, they also think that this location was a lava dome, meaning that there was some level of active volcanic activity below it, which explains another thing that Plato said, because Plato said they had hot and cold running springs. Well, you need volcanic activity to get that. And it just goes on and on and on, lining up. What we know about 9600 BCE in this time period in the Western Sahara, it was what they call the Green Sahara. So it was like, I live in Florida, we mentioned, you live in South Carolina. It was more, actually more my climate than yours, but this nice, it rains all the time. There's rivers. In fact, the middle of Africa had the biggest freshwater lake on the planet at the time, Lake Chad. There are tons of rivers. So it was exactly the environment that's described as the location of Atlantis.
So in 9600 BC,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
How were the sea levels though? Were the sea levels different back then?
Well, if we're in the middle of an ice age and there's more ice, if there's more ice, there's less water. So the sea levels would have been lower.
Mm-hmm.
Matter of fact, there's a famous map called the Piri Reis map. Have you heard of the Piri Reis map?
No, I can't recall.
Okay. If not, you should look it up. It's a very cool map. It was made in 1514, 1515, something like that, like 21 years after Columbus. So Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. This map was made 21 years after 1492 plus 21 is, that's in the 1500s when it was made. And Piri Reis was a Ottoman navigator. And this is because, okay, so we've discovered the new world. And right now, all the countries, everyone's gearing up to go start sailing around the planet. And Piri Reis commissioned this map to be put together from all the ancient maps that the Ottomans had, which were extensive, because his theory was if he could get everything into one map, then as he's out there sailing around, he might have a competitive advantage. And the controversy around this map is that it certainly does seem to show more information on the left-hand side, which is where America and South America and all that is. It shows more detail than was known 20 years after Columbus was there. But more interestingly, to your question, it seems to show on the bottom of the map Antarctica, the coastline of Antarctica without ice. So very, very accurate. And what we now know with satellites is very accurate. It also seems to show the continental shelf, which is what would have been exposed when the seawater was lower, that runs from Antarctica in a solid line up to South America. Seems to show all of that
Mm-hmm.
very accurately. Now, there's arguments against it, but they're no more valid than arguments for it. But what's interesting on this map, this very same map, is on the right-hand side, and everyone's been staring at this thing forever, is the coast of Africa. And no one has ever given it much mind because they knew the coast of Africa. It's not part of the New World. But when you look at it, and you look in the Western Africa, where the Eye of the Sahara is, where the Rishat structure is, on the Piri Reis map, there's this kooky little city surrounded by a ring of water up a river that's blocked by a bunch of mud or blocked by some obtrusion. Well, Plato tells us that after the disaster, it was blocked by what he called a shawl of mud. And where this is literally the Sahara Desert. I mean, this is you die if you don't have water for 6 hours. And there's a city in a river, in a lake surrounded by water. No Ottoman navigator is going to accept that ridiculous map unless it was from a source that was trusted. So here we have preserved a map that shows lowered water levels, just like they would be during the last ice age, and shows a city surrounded by a ring of water in the middle of the Sahara Desert that we now know through Plato matches 99% to what Plato tells us about the city of Atlantis.
So my question is, if it's 9600 BC and it's
Mhm.
345 miles from the coast,
Mhm.
the water level was lower then.
Mhm.
So how's it still 345 miles?
Oh, well, you can look at the continental shelf of Africa, and it doesn't extend anywhere near as far as like Antarctica. And the most affected through it was North America. If you look at Florida, for example, or even where you are in South Carolina down to Florida, you look when you lower the water levels, the shelf is way
Mm-hmm.
out. I mean, maybe not hundreds and hundreds of miles, but dozens and dozens and dozens of miles. On the African side, doesn't extend out anywhere near that far.
Okay. So what kind of we talked about criticisms.
Well, okay, yeah, no, and I actually I addressed these in the book. So there's five. I think there's 4 or 5 here. I got them. I keep them written down because I like to go over them. I think it's important. So the first goes kind of to what you were saying a little bit, which is the first major criticism is that the elevation is too high because this Rishat structure sits, as we said, hundreds of miles inland, and it's like 12 or 1,500 feet above sea level. So how could there be a lake and with an island in it, right? And then I point out to people two things. First, the way weather works, which we all learned in second grade, um, 8 grades before we didn't read Plato, is you have water, like in the ocean, let's say, and the sun shines on it and it gets hot. And so the water turns into, evaporates and goes up into the air and becomes clouds, and the clouds move over land and they rain. Sometimes they rain on mountains, sometimes they rain just on land, sometimes they rain back over the water. But if they rain over mountains and the water goes down the mountains, it forms rivers and goes to the sea. So it's actually, and the slope of this thing is so gentle, you could sail boats up and down it all day long. So I point that out. Then I also point out, have you ever heard of Lake Tahoe?
Hmm.
Yeah, well, that's 6,000 feet. I mean, that's
Yeah,
over a mile.
there's
So that,
lakes in the mountains. I
yeah,
mean, like
yeah,
Crater Lake in Washington.
exactly. Yeah, they're
Yeah,
all over. Yeah, they're all
yeah.
over. So that, and then the geography. The big thing is because it's in the Green Sahara, and we know we have ample rain. We know we have massive lakes that have formed. We have rivers. We know all about them. And you look at its elevation and you look at its accessibility. It's perfect. It lines up perfectly. So that criticism actually becomes a strength. Another criticism is that it was naturally formed. I mentioned many people think it's a volcanic dome. Well, Santorini was a volcanic dome, and many people like that explanation for Atlantis, even though it doesn't fit any of these other actual places. As the capital city, I think it was one of the provinces, but Plato tells us that Atlantis was created by Poseidon. Um, so unless we're saying Poseidon was an actual guy going around digging holes, Poseidon's the god of the ocean and volcanoes and all that stuff. So to me, that's he's saying it was naturally formed. So again, that criticism falls away. Another one is that I like this one. This one is really complex, but it's a fascinating criticism. The criticism is that Plato tells us Atlantis was on the way to the opposite continent. And to get to the Rishat structure, you actually go down the coast of Africa past Morocco, which the claim is that's not on the way, because that you're going a little south. You're going like west and south as opposed to straight west. And so those people tend to like the Azore Islands as the continent of Atlantis. And there's a complicated theory around how the land rose up and went down and all that stuff, which doesn't really fit with anything historically we know. So you have to step out of the thing. But anyway, they say if you sail straight out, you're much more likely to hit the Azore Islands on your way to the opposite continent. So I was like, okay, that's a cool criticism, and that's a legitimate criticism. So how would we answer that? I'm like, well, how can we test it? Well, the only true test we have is Columbus, right? He's the only seafarer that we have an incredibly well documented journey of, who tried to sail from Europe to he was trying to sail to China, but sailed that route without knowing where he was going. So the question is, well, how did he go? Because he actually went to he made 4 trips. So how did he go the first time when he didn't know what he was doing? And then how did he go the other times once he had been there and learned how it all worked? Well, it turns out the way that Columbus went to the New World, even the first time, would have taken him directly by this river entrance to Atlantis, because the way the ocean tides work is you come off of Spain, you come out of the Strait of Gibraltar, whatever, you actually do go down the coast of Africa, and then he actually sailed to the Canary Islands. And then his first time, he then tried to sail directly west. Now he's lower than straight across. But if you remember the story, it's an arduous tale of heroism, if whatever we believe, but it took 10 weeks, which is a ridiculous amount of time. Like for many weeks, they didn't have any wind. There was no current. His guys wanted a mutiny. It was a disaster. Well, so that's not the way to get there then. Even his south, he went a little south. So no. The other 3 times he went, he did exactly what Plato says on how you get to Atlantis. He went out the Strait of Gibraltar, he went down the coast of Africa, he followed the currents to the Canary Islands, and he went across the little tip of West Africa to the little tip of South America, because that's the shortest distance, and that's where the currents take you. And then he went up to Cuba, Venezuela, past Venezuela, Cuba, and all that stuff. He actually never made it to America, what we call America proper. But so, and then you sail by all these islands. So the way to the opposite continent is the way past this Rishat structure thing, and it's the only way. It's the only way. Now, what's buried? Now you talk about the feeling side of Atlantis. Here's you want to get something crazy out of that. This means that, remember, this is a text that the Egyptians gave a guy in 600 BCE, and they're talking about the opposite continent and how to get there. How kooky is that? It's not made up. It's not even controversial. It's just written down in Plato. That's crazy to me. So let me and so we're talking. What is that? 4,700 years ago, they knew how to get to the opposite continent. That's, to me, that's insane.
Well, I think we don't give our ancestors credit.
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they did a lot of things. I think they traveled all over the world,
Yeah. Well, here's
including
what
North America. There's evidence that they came to North America and mined copper in the
yeah.
Great Lakes region. There's evidence of the Chinese coming to the West Coast. There's evidence of the Vikings going up like Mississippi River and all of that. They went all over.
I believe that. I can't prove that. So I try and make it a point to where I'm speculating, which I'm about to do, to agree with you, or
I
where
love
I
to
prove
speculate.
it.
I don't think that's a bad thing because
Me either.
um yeah, there is evidence. There is evidence. It's just ignored or it's not paid attention to because it doesn't meet the narrative.
And I agree
Um
with all that. And I look, and like I say, it's not in the book, but I agree. I think when you really look at it, that remember. So one of the examples I point out is, well, why are we ready to find Atlantis now? What's changed? All that kind of stuff. One of the things I'll say is, well, 150 years ago, this Sleeman guy went looking for Troy, another mythical city, and he did it the same way. He took the Iliad and the Odyssey. So I'm going to read him his history. And when he got there, he found a big mound of stuff, and he dug through it. And they talk about, well, we think Troy was Troy 7, or maybe it was Troy 5, maybe it was Troy 14. They're talking about layers because people kept going away and then coming back and building on the same spot, and the same spot, and the same spot. So to your point about it being ignored, this happened in the Rishat structure too, where it seems to be whatever's sitting on top academically, they attribute to what they find all the way on the very farthest bottom. So if the Aztecs, we know the Aztecs were around in 1500 AD, so they built all of the buildings and stuff that we find in all of Peru, and they built it all in the past 300 years. It's like, no, what? But when you look, you can see the layers. You can see the
yeah.
different types of technology, and the bigger the stones tend to be on the older looking stuff, and all of that.
Yep.
But yeah, but the
Hmm.
answer we get is no. It's like, well, then how'd they do it? Well, complex system of pulleys and work and people. They worked really hard. It's like, well, why would they work that hard on it? What was going on in their lives? They had all this extra time that they could
Right.
dedicate to stupid shit. And the answer is, well, why are you asking me these questions? She's like, okay, thank you. So yeah,
There's a pyramid in, I think it's Chula, Mexico. Have you heard of it? It's
you'd have
as
to give me
big.
more.
It's as big as the Giza, but it's multiple pyramids built on top of each other. So there were
I don't.
several renditions of the pyramid. And there's a nice Catholic church that got stuck on the top when the Spaniards came.
Oh, I think I know the one you're talking about. Yeah, we're gonna find that everywhere. And the big thing, the guy, I write the guy's name down. Let me just find it because I say it wrong. It's a Spanish name. Um, uh, where is it? Hold on. So it's Francisco de Orena, and I'm probably butchering that last name. Uh, you a Spanish speaker? Did you tell me you were?
Yeah, I took Spanish for 6 years.
Okay, so you probably could correct me on that. I appreciate you not doing it and living up to your social media pledge.
We'll go
Um,
with it.
okay, yeah. It's Orella. I know the LLs are pronounced as a Y, so I think it's Oriana. So I'm going.
Yeah, a double L is pronounced like a Y.
Yeah, but anyway,
Mhm.
he was in 1540 something to 42 142. He was the first Westerner, in air quotes, to traverse the Amazon, the canal, the Amazon, not canal, the Amazon River, all the way from the East Coast to the West Coast, and he reported an amazing civilization, just technologically advanced, incredible buildings, crazy and interesting societies and cultures and all this stuff. I guess he had smallpox or something, so they all died. And then it took 100 years for someone to go back and retrace his steps, not knowing anything would happen, and there was nothing. It was just all jungle. So they announced that he made it up. So, and that's still in history. If you go history books right now, sitting in classrooms right now today, still say this, that he made it up. But of course, we have lidar, and in the past 3, 4, 5 years, they've been scanning the Brazilian rainforest and stuff. And what we've discovered is everything that we believe and then some is true, right? Because they found not just a couple cities, but I mean, the entire thing was almost like Manhattan. I mean, all of Central, not all of it, but a lot of the Southern Central America and a lot in South America was just, crazy with buildings and technologies and towns and people and roads and the whole thing. So yeah, all of history is we don't know. I think we don't know most. Graham Hancock says we're a civilization with amnesia. I think that's probably about the best explanation I've heard.
Oh, yeah. And the lesson is that the oral histories that we thought were just stories and myth are
Yeah,
pretty accurate.
I think so. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Now, my personal speculation is that it's even worse. This thing, this Earth, this globe, this spinning blue marble is like a blue marble from hell, and we're stuck in the biggest Groundhog Day cycle, that's ever happened. Because there's been 23 species of humans on the planet. What does that mean? So what events, what cataclysm events that cause that much need for change in the DNA, right? 23 is a lot.
Yeah.
The Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years, yet everything we know is supposed to have happened in the past 5,000 years, which doesn't make a lick of sense.
Hmm.
The dinosaurs were 65 million years ago, and the dinosaurs died and gave us fossil fuels. Whether you like it or not, they did. That cycle could have happened 20 times or more in the history of the planet.
Yeah.
Right. So I think
And
that I think every
we didn't help ourselves when the conquerors came and like burnt all the Mayan transcripts and burnt down
no,
Alexandria and any kind of evidence of our history on the planet, right?
I have tangential evidence that this scroll that we've been talking about for Atlantis that Plato mentions, this
Hmm.
guy who worked for him, Crantor, who I mentioned, he went back to Egypt to verify it, and I'm convinced, and I don't have any evidence of this, but I'm convinced that he put the scroll in the Library of Alexandria because that would be the reason to go back and do that, and then it
Hmm.
burned down, so we
Hmm.
lost it.
Yeah.
And there's something about we just had this happen in the Middle East within the past, I don't even know, 5, 8, 10 years. They're jackhammering and blowing up a lot of the ancient works and stuff. It's
Hmm.
just there's something in our yeah, it's awful. It's just the most terrible thing. I don't know why we do it as a culture.
Well, we do it here. They've done it here,
No,
you
I know.
know?
We do it every day now. We're trying
Yeah.
to we're trying to get rid of information we don't like, which is all this is. It's just so I don't know why that's ingrained as part of us. I just don't know, but it clearly is, and it's an earth culture. It's not a country culture kind of problem.
Yeah. I'm not sure where that comes from, but that's
Yeah,
why, or you think oral history, a lot of the indigenous peoples would pass down their stories orally. And thank goodness they did,
yeah,
because things over time have been destroyed, burnt, conquered, messed with. And they have those stories, and even the Aborigines, they have their stories and about thousands and thousands of years of history. And we're finding out that, hey, they were right. Science is proving that they were pretty accurate.
well, I mean, these people are us, and for some reason they've taken the time to with the oral traditions to capture the information, but then we don't believe them. It's like we don't
Yeah.
believe ourselves, right? And we don't, because it's this weird sense of arrogance, coupled with, I guess, I don't know what the other word is. It's arrogance, and it's just this belief of superiority, like the people were idiots, like they lived 2,000 years ago, so they were stupid. Like, well, I don't think they were stupid. I mean, they didn't have iPhones, but I don't know that makes them the dumb ones.
Yeah, I
uh
think that makes us stupider.
I do. I agree. Look, the Iliad, which I don't even know how many pages. Let's say it's 1,000 pages. Let's pretend it was an oral tradition. It was a Greek oral tradition for hundreds of years, and then someone did finally decide to write it down. Plato, actually Socrates, written about by Plato, ironically, hated writing. he said this was a new technology. Kids these days, they don't bother to remember anything. They just write it down and they go back and look. And he felt that it was impacting people's cognitive abilities. But in school, the Greek kids, they would memorize the entire book, what we call now book, the entire story. And it was the same between all of them. It's not, they can't embellish it because everyone knows the story. So yeah, I can't remember where I put my car keys sometimes, much less a book this thick,
Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had that moment recently when I got up from my chair, walked to the side of my office, and I was like, "What am I getting?"
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So we are different animals, you know?
Yeah, so at the eye of the Sahara, have they found any kind of objects or
Oh
archaeological
yeah.
finds there that connect to Atlantis? Anything
Well,
interesting that they found there?
they found interesting things that connect to the time period, and this is where I mentioned. So, what is the time period? And I know we're getting sensitive to our time period here, but so we mentioned 9600 BCE. This is we're smack dab in the middle of the pre-pottery Neolithic, which is pre-pottery means before pottery, before we figured out you could cook mud and it would hold its form, and of course Neolithic just means new, neo, and then lithic, Stone Age. So we're in the middle of the pre-pottery Neolithic, the new Stone Age, which is also what they call the Neolithic Renaissance or the Neolithic Revolution, where we see people going from pure hunter gatherers to making that transition to agrarian, or you can grow stuff and kill stuff, not just kill stuff. So we know we see the beginning of agriculture in 10,000 BCE. So that's 400 years before Atlantis was destroyed. So I think the Atlanteans were really good at agriculture, and I think that's what we should be looking for. So we have two locations, and I have a guy I work with, David Hansen. He's there right now. As we speak, he's right there. He's in country and he's on site, and we're looking at a number of locations. One of which are these agricultural locations where we think we found massive earthworks and ditches and that kind of stuff that I think have been preserved through a series of luck. On site in the surrounding area, we found tons of the prehistoric Stone Age tools, which is what you would expect to find for people here. This is where I go back to Göbekli Tepe, which I think I mentioned when we started, because Göbekli Tepe dates to this exact same date. I mean, it dates to the exact same day practically. And I think that level of stoneworking technology and society is exactly what we would have seen in Atlantis. And so these are people, they were only a couple generations removed from transitioning from pure hunter gatherers, but so now they're living here. But yeah, we find these stone tools. We find Plato mentions all this. The stones of Atlantis were red, black, and white. Those are the type of stones we find there. We find there's signs of the canal that he mentions, or some of the cutouts that he mentions. I mean, he says that there are mountains to the north and Atlantis was open to the south. We find that geography there and things like that. From actual tools, we find stone tools. We know it was habited. And then what I say, just to close it out, is DNA tells us we all currently believe that humans originated out of Africa, right? So great, so let's accept that. So if that's where we started, why wouldn't we expect to see successful civilizations there? Number one. Number
Mhm.
two, you're talking about a period with good soil, good rain, temperate climate, um, and you have people that aren't idiots that show up and they see this thing. So they see this lake. This is 20 miles across, and in the middle are these massive rings of land, and then an island in the middle. And it's beautiful, right? Because fresh water. You can grow anything. Why wouldn't they take up and live on those rings? Why would they be idiots and just look at it? Because now the saber-toothed tigers can't get to you. I mean, you're protected. You're insulated inland, so it's gonna be hard to attack you. Other tribes, other clans, whatever, are gonna have a hard time attacking you. It's like the best place in the world to live, and you're sheltered. We've already seen the light of agriculture, which we clearly understand. Plato says they used to race horses on one of the rings, so we can see they can farm and have domesticated animals. Why wouldn't you live here? And if people lived here, and we can see someone did live here, and we have history that says this is what they were doing, and it was called Atlantis. Why can't we connect those two things? Which is, I think, what I'm trying to bring together in kind of a unified theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you are pretty thorough about your argument.
Well, you've been grilling me for an hour, so
Not really. Come on.
not really. Not really. Yeah.
So the kingdom, there's a difference between the city and the kingdom. So how big was the Atlantis kingdom?
Well, what Plato tells us is that it was made up of 10 provinces. We know that there was a continent involved, which I believe was West Africa. He tells us it was bordered by mountains to the north, and it had less impressive mountains to the east, which is, well, he didn't say east, but to one side, which we find there. And then he tells us that there were the other 9 provinces were each governed by the elder of a set of twins. So we know it was at least 9 provinces, and he gives us the names of the rulers, which I think linguistically can translate to the names of the locations, just like
Mhm,
the Atlas Mountains do. And so I think you find in there, I think you find the Azores in there. I think you find locations inside the Mediterranean. I think you find Spain in there. I think you can make an argument for the Caribbean, because we have things like the Bimini Road and all that. And when you look at the currents, this is the big thing. When you look, I mentioned Columbus. We just look at the way the currents work. They take you right over to not North America. They take you to South America, and the Caribbean. That doesn't mean you don't end up in North America, but it's a much longer journey because the way
mhm,
is. So I think all that. I think all the things we're starting to find in the rainforest, all that massive building infrastructure, what we can attribute to the Aztec and the Inca, and to a lesser degree the Maya. Um, I think that's was the other side of the trading post that what we're finding. So that was probably part of the
mhm,
kingdom, but it wasn't the capital. But yeah, and it wasn't on the continent, but it was part of the kingdom, which is the third piece.
mhm.
Yeah.
So have you found any evidence on Lemuria?
You know what you mentioned? I am only tangentially aware that Lemuria. I can't even say it. I know it exists. I know it's the Pacific version of the Tale of Atlantis. But
Mhm.
I have stuck in the Western tradition and the Western geography, and stuck with Plato and all that, because of the approach that I've taken. So I haven't looked into it at all.
Well, it's supposed to be in the Pacific, so Hawaii would be the remnant of Lemuria, but also the west coast of North America.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Which makes sense. Yep.
yeah, the coast and then kind of the southwest kind of has that Lemurian vibe, but it was an advanced society like Atlantis, and some of it overlapped, and they got destroyed too. But there's so many stories and theories on how that happened. But basically, Atlantis had those stories too. I mean, Plato doesn't talk about it. He talks about the wave, but what caused the wave? Were
Yeah.
they digging in the earth and messing with the surface of the earth? Did they have technology that affected the weather? I mean, we don't even know what they did.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't, like I said, I can't answer. Like if it was a comet, I don't want to try and I don't want to now take on defending a younger Dryas ending comet impact theory. I don't know. Something happened. You can look at the satellite images even today. You can look at the amount of salt that's accumulated. You can look at things like whale bones that have not
Yeah.
fossilized that were there.
Yeah.
Something happened. Water came up and covered most of Western and Central Africa, ocean water, and then retreated. And
Hmm.
right around 9600 BCE or BC.
Yeah.
What caused it? Don't know. Something did. I don't know what. I don't know that we'll ever know. But it absolutely happened.
Yeah.
Yeah, and when you talk about Lemuria, and you look at Peru, which has, what's that? That's the Aztecs. Is that Peru? I think. The massive, incredible structures, but they could not have traded with someone from the Atlantic because you have the Darien Gap up above Colombia, and then you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles to get to the other side of the Andes Mountains, which it doesn't work. So all of that would clearly be the Pacific culture,
Right.
not the
Hmm.
Atlantic culture of the same, of we believe the same time period from what I'm understanding. So yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yep.
So you've written 45 books. I see some of the titles behind you. So you have Earth 50,000 BC. What's that book about?
That's a sci-fi book series.
Uh-huh.
And what it does is starts off obviously in 50,000 BC. And the idea there is that the solar system is populated by a very advanced civilization. There's still a planet, there's a giant planet where the current asteroid belt is. And we have the good guys and the nefarious bad guys who are fighting for the solar system. The good guys get stranded on Earth, discover all kinds of nefarious and terrible things that are going on, and fight their way to freedom. And there's a lot of robots.
Now, has that been proven, the asteroid belt used to be a planet?
Yep.
No,
No, this
because
is
I
these. I
believe
mean, this is.
that.
I believe it, but this is a pure sci-fi book. But I try all
Yeah.
of my books. I try and base in what I guess is it's called, what they call alternate history or alternate views. But I try fringe topics. I try and take those, and say, okay, well, if this were real, what would have happened? That's for this whole for the sci-fi stuff. I'm like, okay, let's say that was a planet. Let's say that all this stuff did happen. There were, and let's say the UFOs, they're us, right? They're the
Mhm.
civilization that was here before us. What would have happened? What would it have been like? How would it have fallen apart?
There's
What
a
were they worried about?
fascinating book about that. And it's a channeled book, so we're not talking about science. Okay. But
Yeah.
I actually enjoy channel books, like certain authors. I do. And
Okay.
this one's called Through Alien Eyes. And so it's
Okay.
about what happens when that planet blew up and how it came to blow up. And it also talks about why the pyramids were built and why.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I
That's
have theories on. I think we all have. You can start to kind of put it together. And for me, look, I believe kooky things. I mean, I think the moon is a spaceship that was put here to stabilize the Earth because it got hit with something and it wobbles. If the Earth has
yeah.
been here if the Earth has been here 4.5 billion years, how is it still wobbling? How is it still at a 23.5 degree angle and it doesn't have a stable whatever they call it, rotation? How's that possible? Right? And but the moon helps with that. What I mean. So you start to glue it all together,
It's
and that's
some
why I
advanced technology. They're like, well, we're going to put the moon here to keep the Earth's
no,
orbit more stable.
yeah. Look, I think we're on the hamster wheel from hell. I mean, I think something bad happens. Right? Planets get destroyed. And the Earth clearly goes through some terrible catastrophic changes. We talked about let's say that there was a great flood or some horrifying event, and people were
Mhm.
trying to pass information from the last whatever was here to the next whatever was here. I go back to astrology, which kind of emerged. It emerged out of the dark ages, the dark periods, into kind of our current culture. But there was only one message. Everything else about astrology has been made up. I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but it's been made up. The only thing about astrology that came through that veil from the past is that the alignment of the stars impact the fates of man. Okay, which we think we kind of know, right? We think we're learning with the zodiac and all that there's a huge, bigger clock. I've seen people, they've tried to line up cataclysms with the location of the zodiac and all that, and they do tend to line up in a kind of scary way. So it looks like, there's like a 6,000 year cycle, 12,000 year cycle, and there's
Mhm.
there's like 120,000. These all these just cycle on cycle, and I think one of these cycles is really bad, which I don't know how far back it is or how far in front of us it is. But I think that's what all this evidence we find. How's with everything? Everything's been destroyed everywhere. How's that possible?
Well,
Everything has been destroyed.
if you're talking about the meaning of life, I was just writing about this in the conclusion of my book.
Okay,
So
good. Well, in fact, you're writing the conclusion. Congratulations.
yeah, so my book
Yeah.
is I practice shamanic healing, so I do shamanic journeys and soul retrievals, and this is a book about over 80 of them that I've done in
Wow.
7 years for clients, myself, friends, family, whomever.
Right.
So my conclusion is basically this is ironic because there is no conclusion, because there is life after death, and we continue, and we're multidimensional beings experiencing many lives at the same time. So why? Why are we doing this, particularly in planet Earth, on planet Earth? And it's because we are part of source or creator, and we want to experience everything. And it's all about the experience. And then all that experience and information is uploaded back to source. And it's because someday I said I painted a picture of source kind of hanging out there all unified, right? all fine. I just exist. Everything's good. I'm okay. I'm satisfied. And then there was parts that said, hmm, there's got to be something else besides this. And then with
Uh,
that thought, bam, creation. Something was
I like it.
created out of that.
I like it because it solves the why do bad things happen to good people question, right? Because
Yeah,
because if the whole point is to experience everything, you're gonna have to have
right.
some highs and have some lows. So
Hmm.
I like that part of a unifying concept to it.
Yeah. So yeah, fascinating. So what are you
Yeah.
working on now and what makes you excited now? What topics excite you right now?
Well, so for Atlantis, we're working on a documentary. I mentioned I have people in country right now, so we're collecting. We're filming everything, and I should have a documentary coming out on that on the Gaia network in the summer of 2023. Fingers crossed, everything goes well. I'm actually writing two books, which I rarely do, but I'm writing. So my main thriller book, the main character is called Dirk Lasher, and this series is over, but I'm starting a new series with him. And just interestingly to show you in the series, I'm kind of Dan Browning it. Only Dirk is it has fallen in with nefarious people, and they're trying to find the location of Atlantis. So yeah, I kind of wove that in. And then I'm also writing a book called A Glass of the Good Stuff, which I started writing because I love like dime store pulp fiction westerns, just be entertained, be entertained, be entertained. And the thriller books, because they're successful, i have to I have to write them. I have to write them like it's a big boy adult books, and there has to be lots of plots and characters. It takes a long time to get through that. So I paused on that, and I'm in the middle of writing this western called A Glass of the Good Stuff, which is just pure western. The main character is actually the bad guy, not the good guy, although he's conflicted. And it's a lot of gunfights and that kind of stuff. Simpler prose, I guess you would say.
Yeah,
So I'm
where do
working on
you
all of
get
that.
all your ideas and inspiration from?
So what I do is I read a lot. I've read all of my life. I wouldn't say I was an avid reader though. I mean, I was always reading a book, but I wouldn't spend all weekend reading a book, anything like that. But what I noticed was the stories that I like uh, have kind of gone away. I'm I know I'm old. Culturally we're thrilled to push me aside, and now we have new stories and new narratives. But for me, I like a hero who has a hard time and has a lot of flaws and has to kind of fight their way through some really bad things that happen, and probably wins in the end, although maybe the price was too high. Maybe not, because every book can't
Yeah.
be the same. But I like those stories. So what I do is I find a picture that winds up being the book cover, and then I say, if I were to buy this book, what would that be? So then I write the blurb, they call it. And I read the blurb. I said, oh, this is interesting. I like this book. If I were to read it, what would it say? And then I start writing, and that's kind of how I do it. So the book
Wow.
cover, yeah, the book cover. And then because I'm doing this on my own, I'm self-publishing. I don't have some big publishing company, but then my book cover now looks like it was custom made for the book because it was truly the inspiration for the story. It doesn't tell the story, but at least it lines up. Because one of the harder things as an independent author who writes a lot of books is if you pay someone, these covers can be hundreds or even thousands of dollars. And I can't afford that. I don't make that much writing books. So yeah, so that works. And I like the adventure stories, and I like good heroes.
Well, that's interesting because you would think you would write the book first and then get the book cover, but you're starting with the book cover. So how are you finding your book covers?
Literally, I subscribe to the Adobe clip art. No, it's not clip art, whatever it is, Adobe images and all that stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
Stock, they call it stock.
Uh-huh.
And then I have an idea, and then I'll type that word in, and I'll see all the images, and I'll just flip through page after page till I find that one that resonates with me, and then I'll grab it.
So literally a picture is worth 1,000 words or more.
70,000 if you're going to try and sell them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So pictures worth 70,000 words. Exactly.
Well, I really enjoyed talking with you, David. We could probably talk about 20 other different topics, I imagine. But, you know, if you want to come back and talk about another one of your books or something different, I'd be really open to that.
Sure.
So just share with the audience where they can contact you and find all of your 45 books you've written.
Yeah. No, the publisher website, I mean, it's I'm the publisher, but it's called frequency99.com. The nines are numbers, so frequency99.com. It's got all my books up there. It's got contact information. Upcoming events are listed up there. We have the teaser poster for the documentary we're working on, and that's the central point for all things David Edward.
And why did you come up with 999?
Oh, just two nines, just frequency99.com.
Oh, just 99.
Well, because the original idea was, well, what frequency are you on? Tune to frequency 99. It was that kind of thing.
Very high frequency.
Exactly. The highest, look, the highest 2-digit frequency you can get. So
I'll
yeah.
prove it to you. So last night I had a Reiki share. And in a Reiki share, you give each other Reiki. Reiki practitioners do it. And then they give Reiki to people who want to experience it, or want to receive extra healing or whatever. So so I had 2 Reiki masters working on me. And one of the Reiki masters can see things when she's working on people. She sees like visions or images. And she said, I saw some being, is what she called it, on your right that's wearing a blue robe with a golden trim. But I couldn't figure out what it was. I couldn't see the face. And then I asked her, was that Mother Mary? Because oftentimes Mother Mary, she wears the blue cloak and the hood, right?
Okay. I know. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I'm very connected to the Marys, Mary Magdalene, Mother Mary, the priestesses of Mary. And she's like, I'm not sure. But she said, on your left, all I saw was a figure full of light, and it was huge. And I said, oh, Archangel. And she's like, probably. So if your frequency is high enough, right? And we had been working on each other for an hour, I think, 6 different people in a room. She was able to see something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I didn't look up. I don't know what angel number 99 is. I'll have to look it up. Hopefully it's a good one.
Well, 99 adds up. If you look at numerology, 99 adds up to 18, which is 9, and 9 is all about endings. But whenever you have an ending, you have new beginnings.
I like to finish books. Got to finish writing the book.
Well, thank you so much. Everybody check out David's books, and thank you for being on the show.
Sure. All right, Tina. Thank you very much for talking to me. I enjoyed it.